everyone. Thanks for being here. This is Pedro. I met him during the Serious Science Summit, and he has some wonderful research and some good overlaps with our lab, so I'm excited to hear about his work today. He's currently a fifth-year PhD student and a graduate research assistant in mechanical engineering at CU Boulder. Also works with Ceres. His research focuses on carbon cycle greenhouse gases at the NOAA Global Monitoring Lab, and he leverages machine learning, turbulence modeling, and statistical analyses to better understand methane emissions from oil and gas extraction in offshore regions. Before pivoting to environmental data science and large-scale workflows, he specialized in complex fluids and got a master's degree in materials engineering and condensed matter physics for his work on polymers and liquid crystals. So awesome.
Thanks
for being here. And
yeah, sure. Thank you.
Excited to share about your work. Yeah.
It's great to be here. And we'll be talking a little bit about my research. Thank you for the intro. So yeah, I work with Gavin Hensey in the mechanical engineering department and with Lori Burweiler at NOAA GML. And yeah, today we'll be talking a little bit about this machine learning based analysis that we have been developed. And we want to better understand offshore oil and gas methane emissions in the Gulf of Mexico. So this is just a disclaimer. So all data here is preliminary. And the final plots, in my interpretation of the results, are of course subject to change. And we do have other co-authors, but the simulations, plots, and interpretation of the data is my own. Oops, okay. Yeah, so this is just a short outline of what I want to talk about today. I want to answer those 5 questions here. So the first is, I want you to understand why methane is important. So why do we study methane? And why do we study specifically fugitive methane from offshore oil and gas extraction processes? The second question that I want to answer is, how can methane be measured and how do those observations can be estimated? So how much methane is leaking from what we can see in those images? And how can we improve current estimation methods? The third question is, how would machine learning help us recognize plumes in images that we observe from satellite images, from satellite retrievals? The fourth question is, what are the errors associated with wind uncertainties? So when you have an observation there that's happened in the past, you need some wind data from a location back in time. So you can't go back in time and measure how strong the winds were there. So you can estimate how much methane is leaking from that source. And the fifth, I just want to talk about the future directions of this project later on. So let's start by tackling the first question. Why is methane important? Methane is super important because it is one of the main drivers of climate change. It is a short-lived pollutant compared to CO2. So its atmospheric lifetime is shorter than carbon dioxide. That's important. Its global warming potential is higher than that of CO2. And global warming potential is defined as the potential that a chemical has of warming up the surface of the Earth compared to the same amount of carbon dioxide. As you can see here, it's higher than the standard, which is carbon dioxide. And as you can see here in this graph, the concentration of methane in the atmosphere is rising with time. So those rising concentrations that means that methane presents an opportunity for us to slow down global warming as we transition from traditional fossil fuels, carbon-based fuels to something else. And this is a very interesting work by ACO. And here we have the global anthropogenic methane emissions projected to be emitted by the year 2030. And if you check out this pie chart here, each slice is a different economic sector. And the the size of each slice is how much methane we're emitting depending on that sector. So you see two slices that are larger than others. One is livestock, the other is oil and gas. So let's start by looking at livestock. This darker shade here is the residual emissions in that sector. So that is the amount of methane that we cannot avoid. If we are to have livestock at all, this is how much methane we're emitting. There is no getting around that. Then we have a medium shade of that color, which are the emissions that are technically feasible to be reduced. So this is what we could reduce using current technology, but at a cost. And then we have this lighter shade here, which is if we reduce those emissions here, we're going to do it at a profit. So if we employ those technologies here to reduce this tiny portion of those methane emissions here, we're going to get some money back by employing those measurements. But if you look at the oil and gas slice, which is the second largest in the chart, you see that just this tiny amount is residual. Then you have from 80 to 85%, that's debatable, which is what is technically feasible, but non-economically feasible. And then what is economically feasible. So from anywhere from 50 to 85% is the amount of methane that we can stop emitting out there to the atmosphere in the oil and gas industry at a profit. So as I was telling you before, out of all sources of methane, why do we care about oil and gas? We know that human activities have more than double the amount of methane that is out there in the atmosphere. And I like these two quotes in the same paper that I was showing the graphs, the pie chart that I was showing you before. And the other is methane emissions are a major and growing driver of climate change, and it's responsible for roughly a third of today's warming. So this is a graph from that same paper. This is roughly today and how much we're expected to warm the surface of the earth in 100 years-ish. So this is the baseline of how much methane is warming the surface of the earth in that time frame, roughly 0.91 degrees Celsius. This is how much we can avoid by applying those economically feasible approaches that I was telling you before, and the technically feasible approaches. So we can more than halve the warming of the Earth's surface just by applying what we know right now about mitigation strategies. And I was telling you why oil and gas extraction is an important part of the industry, but why is offshore oil and gas important? So about a third of the oil and gas in the world is produced offshore. It is from Eric Cord. He is a professor at UMich, and this is a very nice podcast. Eric Cord was invited to talk about offshore methane emissions, and he conducted the field campaign, which is a field campaign in the Gulf. So he visited a bunch of platforms here, and he measured methane leaks at all of those locations. And here are some highlights of the campaign. One is observed methane emissions exceed inventories, elevating the carbon intensity of the basin to over twice official inventories. So we know that what these people are reporting is not exactly 100% consistent with his observations from the field campaign. And the carbon intensity of oil and gas production varies widely across the Gulf. So depending on the platform type and location, some of those would be leaking more, some of those would be leaking less, and sometimes much more than expected and much more than reported. So I want to answer one more question, which is, how can we measure methane? So we know that methane is being leaked out there, and there are three main ways that we can measure methane. One is ground-based. So ground-based sensors are accurate and cheap. Those are the biggest advantages of ground-based methods, but they are labor-intensive and they require physical presence at the site, and you need numerous individual measurements. So those are the downsides of ground-based. And if we move on to airborne They are accurate, just like ground-based methods, and they can cover large areas because you're on an airplane flying over an area. But the downsides are, one, you need an aircraft, they are expensive. Second is you need authorization to be in the aerospace of that site that you can see the methane emissions coming from. And the third is satellite, which is what we're interested in here. Satellites can image very large areas repeatedly because the satellite is up there, it is looking at the Earth, and it doesn't matter what you do, the satellite will be observing very large areas continuously, and you can monitor areas effectively. But the downsides are resolution is lower than the above because satellites are much further off than airborne or ground-based. They are far from the emission sources, and data processing is difficult. So this is not a problem that we are going to solve, but we're trying to help develop the methods that are going to facilitate this data processing of satellite observations. And now that we know how we can observe methane using satellites, how can we estimate leaks? There are three main ways that we can do that. One is the source pixel method. So you have a satellite observation here. You look at the source of the emission. You look at that pixel where you know the source is coming from. You measure or calculate how much the wind speed was at the surface, and then you can calculate how much methane is coming out of that pixel. Or you can say that your plume is approximately Gaussian, and then the cross-section of the plume will determine the effective wind at that location, and then you know how much mass is going through that cross-section of the plume. And then the third, which is what we're going to talk about here today, is the integrated methane mass enhancement, which is you simulate some turbulence effects in the atmosphere. You have an artificial leak, a synthetic experiment that you simulate, and then you can develop a method that will be able to backtrack how much methane was being emitted at the source from your turbulence measurements. And in the IME method, which is the integrated methane mass enhancement, you have this expression here. It's a very simple expression. So the source rate will be given by the methane enhancement in the image, so how strong your signal is, the effective wind speed at the source, this is something we're going to talk about later on, and the plume length, which is the square root of the plume area from the plume mask, which is the area where you have methane in there. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about turbulence in large eddy simulations, which is how we simulate turbulence. So with the IME method, IME is determined by the satellite measurement. So I showed you a satellite observation before. You have a concentration map of methane. You have methane enhancement, how much methane is standing out from the background. That is determined by the image. The length of the plume is determined by the plume mask. So you mask the methane plume. You count the number of pixels, you know the pixel resolution, you get the square root of that. That's the plume length. But the only missing quantity now is U effective, and we don't know yet how to determine it. And the thing is, from a simulation with a set source rate, so you simulate a synthetic methane emission experiment, you can isolate U effective in that expression before, and you define the leak rate Q in your simulation. You can calculate L at each time step, and you know the methane enhancement at each time step as well. In your turbulence software, in our case, the weather research and forecasting model, the large eddy simulator 4, will also calculate a 10-meter wind speed at that location. So from a bunch of points, what you can do is at each time step, get what U10 was, the 10-meter wind speed at the source location, and get what this quantity here, which is the effective wind speed, was for your particular plume. And then you can have a scatter plot like this and fit a curve through your points. So this is the original paper that presented this method. And this is the curve that they got. So U effective is approximately 0.9 times the log of the 10-meter wind speed plus 0.6. But the thing is, we don't know if this graph or if this relationship is going to be valid for offshore simulation. So this is one of the things that we want to find out. And for that, we have expanded on the original paper. So the original IME paper only used input data from land locations: Oakland, Reno, Dodge City, Peachtree City, and Del Rio. But these are the oil and gas extraction platforms in the Gulf, the American ones. And as you can see, there are a bunch of them here, and none of those locations are close to the Gulf exactly. So we don't know for sure if the IME method is going to be accurate if we have some offshore observations and you're using it to estimate how much methane was leaking from there. So our plan was to expand the model data using coastal data from the same database that's in the original paper, the NOAA IGRA2, and offshore data from one of our collaborators, which was two of them actually. They took part in the NASA Scope 2 field campaign, which was a field campaign that measured oil and gas emissions in soundings at those locations in the Gulf, at some offshore oil and gas platforms. So this is the map that I showed you guys before. B are the input potential temperature profiles that were used to generate the turbilations in the original paper. And in C, you can see those coastal, the sounding profiles from those coastal cities. And here are the offshore sounding profiles, some of them from the Scope 2 field campaign. Now you can see here, those temperature profiles are very different from each other. All the coastal cities present similar sounding profiles. And if you look at the offshore sounding profiles, which are the most interesting here, I think, closer to the surface, potential temperature will be pretty much constant up until a certain height, until you reach the boundary layer of the planet. And then you're going to have a really strong inversion. So the temperature will shoot up sharply past the boundary layer, which is not the case for plumes over land. But does it matter? This is what we're going to find out. So those are the technical parameters of our simulations. I think the most important things here are we were simulating 9 kilometers by 9 kilometer domain with a resolution of 25 meters effectively. And our vertical profile was 2.4 kilometers, 2,400 meters, and 190 vertical layers. And those are really computationally intensive. So to simulate one individual plume from one of those locations, we need roughly a month on a supercomputer. And that is a lot of computing power. And then this is, again, technical details about how we were masking the plumes. So here we have a clean LES tracer map, and then we apply 4 filters to this clean map. We add noise to simulate a satellite observation, then a student t-test to see what points are statistically significant from the noise. Then we apply a median filter to filter out the speckle in the image. Then a Gaussian filter to blur out the image, and a threshold mask to remove the spots in the image. So from the plume mask, we can now calculate the plume area and methane enhancement from this image here. So we can apply the plume mask to the tracer plus noise image and calculate IME. And as I told you, we can use this to isolate the effective and plot the updated effective wind speed curve. And this is what we have right now. So those simulations are still running. What can we see here? In green, you have the original IME curve. And this dashed blue line is our results from our offshore simulations. So as you can see, it seems to be systematically lower than the green curve, the original IME curve. And we can see that the logarithm coefficient here is pretty similar to the original IME method, but we saw some vertical offset that makes it different from the original study. And we also know heavier clustering both points. And I'm going to try to explain why this is the case compared to the original IME plots, which are more scattered out. And to explain that, I have plotted some vertical profiles of those plumes that we simulated. And on the right here, you have a cross-section of the plume, a vertical cross-section of the plume along the center of mass. This is the height of the center of mass, and the dashed red line, and the solid blue line here, light blue line, is the line where below the line 95% of the plume's mass is located. So we can plot this bar plot for the offshore plumes, and as well as some plumes from the original work. And here we have offshore plumes with varying initial wind profiles. So what we've done here was we initiated the simulations using a uniform wind profile, but using the soundings, the temperature profiles from before. And as we can see here, the plume center of mass is suppressed as we move up in initial wind speeds. So does the plume top 95% of the plume top 95% height, and the plume spread as well. So here we have center of mass in blue. We have in orange the top 95% of the plume, and in green the plume vertical spread. And if you compare those offshore simulations to the simulations over land from the original paper, you can see that the plume center of mass is significantly lower at times than those simulations over land, making us conclude that what is most likely happening here is our plumes are confined closer to the surface, and the vertical spread is also reduced. So our plumes are more concentrated offshore compared to over land. And this leads me to think that advection is probably dominated by wind shear and not turbulence or thermals like over land. So you have a much stronger heat flux over land, causing much stronger thermals. And offshore, what is probably happening is the plumes are likely trapped closer to the surface because that strong inversion is probably causing a vertical stratification. We probably have higher pressures up that are confining the plumes near the surface and making them more confined, being around calmer winds. So to check this hypothesis, I've also perturbed the initial sounding. So what I've done here was I got all of the offshore sounding profiles, temperature sounding profiles that I had before, applied a near surface thermal shock, so some random noise to the surface, and I applied an envelope that would die out as we would move from the boundary layer to the inversion layer. And I kept the strong inversion constant, so it was preserved. And I want to know if those variations closer to the surface are going to cause any difference to the plume physical properties of the plume morphology. And we varied the noise from 0.05 to 0.20 while preserving the atmospheric inversion. And the thing is, the plume parameters do not seem to change with such perturbations. It doesn't matter how much we perturb the near surface region of the plume. And I didn't show those plots here because they were literally the same as these for the same initial conditions and the same for the effective wind speed, same parameters, same look of the plot, just with some minor statistical variations. But this leads us to think that this vertical stratification is what's causing those differences in what we were observing. So it does make a difference if we're estimating plumes offshore or over land. Now I want to talk a little bit more about the machine learning detection of the plumes, which is, I think, one of the most interesting things of this project. And why do we do that? Why do we care about machine learning plume identification? Well, the thing is, the amount of data to be analyzed is constantly growing because the instruments are up there. They're making observations, and they can analyze those images, process those images, and look for plumes. But the thing is, it is a very laborious process. And then you need independent scientists looking at the same images, trying to find meaningful signals, then comparing to what other people are observing and see if their observations match, their interpretation of the data match, and then trying to look for plumes. So it is a very hard task. And the thing is, it is impractical to mask real world plumes. So you can't just look at real world data, mask the plumes manually, and then have a meaningful amount of data to train a machine learning model. So what we do here is we have a plume-free satellite background. So this is a real world observation. And then we pair that with our simulations. So our large eddy simulations from before, turbulence simulations. Those are floating point maps. So they are not images. How that image is going to blend with the satellite background will depend on the specific instrument and the plume mask that we calculated from the methodology that I've shown you before. So then we generate a simulated satellite observation, and we get the same plume mask from the masking process before, and then one image mask pair. So here we have a simulated satellite observation plus a plume mask will be one training point to our machine learning training script. So we collect a bunch of those, give it to TensorFlow. TensorFlow is going to calculate the UNet parameters and then be able to identify plumes in images. So I'm going to talk a little bit in more detail about what I just explained it to you before. Here we have the clean plumes, which are the concentration maps simulated through LES. Then the clean plumes are overlaid on plume-free satellite backgrounds. So this is a plume-free satellite observation from that same satellite that I showed you the plume from before. We calculate how this enhancement is going to look on here. If we have an observation done by this instrument with this emission rate, this is what it's going to look like at this location. Then what we do here is we shift this around because the plume can be coming from different areas, different platforms. It can be coming from pipes or from other junctions, between gas transport lines or oil transport lines. And then we can rotate those plumes to expand the data set and take into account variations in wind directions as well. So the plume mask will be shifted and rotated accordingly. So this is still a work in progress, but this is our idea. We already have the plumes. We want to scrape the satellite data and do this for a bunch of satellite backgrounds. I also want to answer another question that I posed before, which is how accurate are wind inputs offshore? So I think you're going to find this interesting because moving a little bit on from plume detection, we need to know how accurate our wind speeds are. And the thing is, you have made an observation in the past. And when you're analyzing the data, you cannot go back in time and check how winds were then and there. So usually what scientists do is they use global or continental models to interpolate what the wind speed was then at the location of the leak and at that time that the leak was happening. But the problem is, due to the assimilation nature of those models, they tend to be less accurate offshore because you have less data to assimilate from. And we want to know by how much those are inaccurate. So I found this Hurdy Python library. It is a Python wrapper for other packages that can search for, download, decompress, and store forecast projects. And Hurdy supports several models, including the global forecast model, North American model, high resolution rapid refresh model, and the global ensemble forecast model. And we can compare those to in situ observations from the National Data Buoy Center. So here we have some stations in the Gulf that are administered by the FAA and the NOAA NDBC, so the National Data Buoy Center, and sometimes others, but usually FAA and NDBC, which are the ones that are relevant to us. So every roughly 20 minutes, they measure wind speed and direction at those points, among other things. So if we check data from the National Data Buoy Center, they have some disk buoys in the ocean with some fixed anemometer height, and we can convert the wind speeds at that height to 10-meter wind speeds using this expression. And if we plot the correlation between in situ wind speeds and wind speeds by those models, this is what we observed. So there's a lot to unpack here. I have done this for this buoy here for 2040, and I've done it for the other buoys here as well. They all seem approximately the same. And what I've done here was I picked the times where observations are usually made and compared the wind data in situ there to what the models were going to measure at those locations. And this is the correlation that I observe. And as you can see, it is expected that the model is going to have a certain bias here. So they will be overestimating winds for calmer winds, and they will be underestimating them for stronger winds, but they're going to be doing pretty well. And in the back here, I have the distribution of winds at those locations. So I think that's also something that I found interesting to observe. I'm gonna wrap this up, talk about some future directions, because this is an ongoing project with more questions, with some questions to be answered and even more others to be asked. So my next step is training the machine learning model. So I've done this for a couple of those offshore observations from a single satellite instrument. What I want to do is write a scraper that will automatically download good enough images. So this is a bit of a challenge right now, because if you look at one image and you look at it and you see that it's good, then you can use it, that's fine. But how can we do that automatically in the goal? And then use the background to our plumes and train the machine learning model and do that progressively. The third is evaluate image segmentation performance using real world data. So use actual observations and see if our machine learning model can actually segment plumes from the background. I also want to perform this glint analysis from simulated albedo. So what is glint? Data is only useful, offshore data is only useful when sun glint is present, which is winds are going to cause the surface of the ocean to be rough, so it's no longer going to be smooth, and that's what's going to scatter sunlight that is reflecting off the surface of the ocean. And to observe anything, we need light. In this case, methane plumes. So there are only two glint opportunities for heliosynchronous instruments: one mid-morning and the other mid-afternoon. So we want to see what the wind profiles look like at those two times of the day, and then simulate satellite reflection, an ocean reflection as captured by the satellite. So this is a simulation that I've made. Instead of using real world satellite observations, what I want to do is simulate my own background depending on that wind speed distribution that I've shown you before, and see what is the likelihood that we're going to observe a plume if we have enough sea surface roughness compared to when leaks are just too weak to be observed. So I want to separate one from the other. So this is how this works usually. So wind drives sea surface roughness. Sea surface roughness causes reflection of infrared light. Methane absorbs in the infrared. And then from the wind speed distribution that I've shown you before, we hope to calculate the shift in the probability of detection curves using Monte Carlo. And this is some sketch that I've made. This is the theoretical probability of detection for an instrument published by them. It depends on noise and resolution of the instrument. So this is a sigmoid curve. But we know that offshore, this probability of detection is degraded, so it is shifted right. And this is more or less what we think the case is. So this is empirically what we think the probability of detection curve looks like actually for any instrument actually. I'm not calling them out. This is just a hypothetical instrument. This would be the probability of detection. The thing is, from field campaigns, this is from the field campaign, we can have a distribution of leaks in that region. So we can, knowing the types of platforms and how much they leak, we can fit a hypothetical distribution of this data using more points, and then integrate this probability of detection over the hypothetical distribution of leaks and see how much we're missing in terms of methane mass. So how much is being emitted that we can't physically see because of the limitations in our instruments. So I want to calculate exactly how much this shift is to the right so that I can see if we're missing only 20% of the methane that is being emitted, if we're missing like roughly 40% or maybe more. I want to try to prove that. Yeah, that's it. That's all I have for today, and I opened the field too.
It goes great. Are there any questions?
I just wanted to say I really like the quotes.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
For your plume work, I noticed that a lot of the plumes, or all the plumes, involve these masks that I'm assuming are just like binary values. How do we move from that to actually quantifying the emissions of methane, like at the landscape level, for example, or from a certain point in time? I guess my question involves like, how does time factor into plume dispersal and what that looks like over the course of annual emissions, for example?
Right. So, so two things. One is we can estimate the plume lifetime. So how much it takes for me show you the plume animation or no, the plume. Here should be fine. So the plume lifetime is how much it takes for methane to be transported roughly from the source to the center. So depending on how large that is, that will affect how accurate you are in estimating methane, right? So if it does that faster, it's one thing. If it does it slower, it's another thing. The other is those leaks, you're right, are not constant. So we don't know if they are emitting if they were emitting at that source rate for a long time, or if there was just a spike in emission rate or not. So what we want to do is, I've written this proposal before. It didn't get approved, but we're probably doing this again, which was get enough money to purchase satellite observations at a location that we know that leaks frequently. Any of those platforms that we know that leaks frequently, observe that constantly. So write a proposal to ANMAP, which is an European satellite, and this got approved. So they can look at one of those locations monthly, buy proprietary data from a third-party satellite, see how much methane is leaking at different points in time, and then understand from that final analysis of the shift in probability of detection, how much of those differences were caused by the leak rate variability and how much was changed by the background changing. So this is something that we still want to answer.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just have just a question about your LES runs, like the setup. What was the height of the domain?
2400.
Okay, so are you in like boundary layer stuff, simulations? Do you assume that it's like a fully compressible atmosphere?
Yes.
Okay, well, and that's why you have such a sort of small time step, I guess. Okay,
I mean, and this is the IO time step,
Oh, okay.
but the simulation time step is
Even-
much smaller.
Okay, what is it, like a second?
A second, it's sometimes less because it's calculated by Wharf. So
Okay.
you
Oh,
can,
sure,
you can
sure.
set that to be fixed.
Yeah.
But what I said was, I told Wharf, hey, calculate what's the optimal time step
Yeah.
for this time step. And
Okay.
then it's going to do that internally. And depending on
Do you have like any for the land plumes? Do you have any like topography? Like how do you?
we
as those-
can, we just don't, because we didn't simulate any land plumes. I mean, these are from the original paper. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I got the data from him. He is one of our collaborators, so he just gave us the net CDF data. And then we just plotted what he had simulated, but you can't have topography.
So, do you mind if I?
No, go ahead.
So in the upper atmosphere, we often assume like a above the boundary layer in like the troposphere, we often assume like it was an elastic approximation. So you get rid of that really restrictive time step constraint that you have with a compressible atmosphere. Have you ever like tried that, relaxing the compressibility
No, I've never
assumption?
tried that, but this is a good point actually, because I'm trying to learn more about LES. Because the thing is, I knew something about fluids in general, but not the LES specific. So I'm trying to.
I don't know if Wharf has that. I don't know if Wharf has that option. It's like I think hard coded to be like a compressible.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's super funny, but Wharf can kind of do that automatically. So it can add realistic perturbations to your simulation. So it can add Coriolis forces, and you can use forecast in reanalysis wind models to get winds at the boundaries and that kind of stuff. But I'm still trying to learn what we can do with Wharf, and it's such a huge model that.
Question. So I see most of these plumes that you said are from like oil and gas
Yes.
money, right?
Yeah.
How do those companies, like, do they know that you're monitoring it? Do you have like relations with them? Are there ways to like try to mitigate it? Or are they kind of just ignoring all of this?
Yeah, so the thing is, we're just simulating the forms, and the people from the field campaigns, they do monitor them. They're the ones responsible for monitoring those.
But they're not associated with the companies.
They're not associated with the companies.
Do they have connection with them? Or like is there any way to mitigate is my question, basically?
Yeah, so the thing is, they can reach out to the companies and then tell them, hey, you're leaking this much.
Mm-hmm.
This is what we found. Are you going to do something about it so that we can report that you did something about it and make us look good? I mean, by saying that, hey, this had practical effects in methane emissions. And sometimes they do. So I've read reports about companies like saying, oh, no, this is great. Thank you for helping us
Oh, good.
mitigating emissions. And sometimes they just flat out refuse
That would have been my guess.
the evidence that was presented. And sometimes they're just silent about stuff. So they just go silent. Yeah. But sometimes they try to claim that, oh, you're absolutely not leaking that much.
So they can claim some greenwashing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. Huh. Any other questions?
Maybe it's a stupid question, but I wonder if these methane plumes interact with other air pollutants. You show that there are some
Right.
inversions and sulfate-related air pollutants are also existed, and how these air pollutants make dynamics for the ozone or PM2.5 for coastal populations.
Right. Especially here. The thing is, we simulate methane as a tracer gas. So we assume that it does not have any effect back on the atmosphere, that it's being emitted, and it does not interact with other chemicals as well. But we're thinking about that actually, because two things that we know make a difference here. One is methane, the background methane is probably larger here than elsewhere because we have methane being actively emitted from those locations. So it means that neighboring platforms are probably leaking methane to the atmosphere, enhancing the concentration and other chemicals as well. So we are actually thinking about using other models that are going to introduce chemistry to the problem and then help us answer that. Like geoscam is something that we could use and then see what's happening here and try to make methane interact with other chemicals and see what is happening here. Of course, not at an individual plume scale, because I think that's going to be a much harder problem, but at a more regional kind of thing.
All right. Thank you, Pedro. Great.